Good afternoon, students. Welcome to the sixth video lecture for our course. This lecture will cover interview number 6 in a refutation of moral relativism. Here we're still considering arguments in favor of moral relativism, and we're going to consider 3 different arguments. I'll spend a little bit more time on a couple of them just to make sure that we have a deep understanding of the details of those arguments. Once again, take good notes. I'll repeat things. If I repeat something, that's a good indication that you should take notes upon it, or notes on it. And when I go through the arguments, make sure you're structuring your arguments properly so that you're writing them down, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on and so forth. And then leaving yourself space or making sure that you have some way of explaining to yourself in your notes when I'm commenting on each one of those steps. Okay, let's get to it. The third argument that Libby presents in favor of moral relativism is the argument from social conditioning. So you might in your paper write down argument 3 for moral relativism from social conditioning. And this is probably one of the most well-known versions or well-known arguments for moral relativism. And the argument goes like this. Here's how I'll present it. Step 1, our values are conditioned in us by society. Step 1, our values are conditioned in us by society. Step 2, if something is conditioned in us by society, then it is subjective. 2, if something is conditioned in us by society, then it is subjective. 3, hence our values are subjective. 3, hence our values are subjective. Okay, so let's go through this argument, making sure that we understand each one of the steps and ISA's responses to them. Step 1 says that our values are conditioned in us by society. In other words, you have the values that you have because of the society or culture into which you were born. This is a common claim, and it's likely to be true. We've got some empirical evidence for it. There's empirical evidence actually that suggests otherwise too. We'll talk about some of that empirical evidence in a little bit. But step 1 just says something familiar. All of us have this sort of gut feeling about it. Our values are conditioned in us by society. Okay, now ISA says right here, he makes a very important distinction. This is a crucial distinction for you to get. He says that step 1 actually begs the question. In other words, in order to believe step 1, you have to already be committed to moral relativism, to the claim that our values are subjective, or that value is subjective. You have to already be a moral relativist in order to accept premise 1. Why? Well, because ISA says that the moral absolutist is going to make a distinction between value and value opinion. Okay, so there's a distinction between value and value opinion, or maybe a better way of putting it might be this. There's a distinction between morality, the moral truths, the moral laws, the moral rules, and moral opinion, our opinions about the moral truths, the moral laws, the moral rules. We can think about this with respect to other subject matters. So there are the truths of physics. Let's call those the laws of nature. There are the laws of nature that govern the physical, material, spatio-temporal world. Those are the laws that exist. They've existed for a long, long time. They exist whether we think they do or not. They exist independently of us, and our job is to discover, or the scientist's job is to discover those laws. Laws of physics. Maybe there are separate laws of chemistry, separate laws of biology, and so on and so forth. So we've got those, the laws, the truths of physics and chemistry and biology and math and so on and so forth. And then we also have our opinions, right? So we might call, we could make the distinction along these lines. We've got the the physical truths, the chemical truths, the biological truths, and then we also have physical opinions, chemistry opinions, biology opinions. And so we want to make a distinction between that because we recognize that throughout history we've been wrong about various claims we've made with respect to physics, biology, chemistry. And we're likely wrong today about many of the claims we're making. And so we engage in various types of exercises in order to discover the truths of physics, biology, chemistry, and so on. So there are the biology, chemistry, physics, math, facts, and then there are our opinions about them. Now, what ISA is saying is that if you're the moral absolutist is going to make a similar distinction with respect to morality or with respect to the realm of value. So with respect to morality or the realm of value, the moral absolutist is going to say there are the value facts, the moral facts, and then there are our opinions about those. And of course, our opinions could be wrong. And indeed, if we look at history and even today, many of our opinions are likely to be wrong. So there was a time when we thought that a certain type of slavery, it's called chattel slavery, where we viewed slaves as property. We thought that was morally permissible. We now think that we were grossly mistaken. There was a certain culture that viewed Jews as being pernicious, dangerous, and that they could do pretty much anything to them. We now think that that culture was wrong, right? So they had value opinions about Jews, value opinions about black persons. We've had value opinions about women, value opinions about babies, about the elderly, about the handicapped and mentally ill, and so on and so forth. We've had value opinions, and then over time we come to think that those value opinions were mistaken and that now we're closer to the value facts. So we make that distinction implicitly when we change our value opinions. We implicitly make the distinction between value opinions and value facts. We change our value opinions because we're trying to conform our beliefs to the facts. That's the goal. Okay, so you now have this distinction between value opinions and value facts, or moral opinions and the moral facts. That's what the moral absolutist is going to maintain. Now, the moral absolutist will now rephrase premise 1 as our value opinions are conditioned in us by society, but it makes no sense to say that our value facts are. The facts exist independently of us. We're trying to discover those facts, just like our physics opinions, our biology opinions, our chemistry opinions, our math opinions are conditioned in us by society, by the culture in which we are born. It doesn't follow that physics facts, biology facts, chemistry facts, math facts are conditioned in us. Those facts exist independently of us, and the opinions that we have are an attempt to conform our minds to those facts, to match mind and reality. That's the goal with respect to belief. So the moral absolutist is going to say we have to distinguish between value opinions and value facts. Once we do that, the third argument from social conditioning fails, right? Because if our value opinions are conditioned in us by society, and then the argument goes, if something is conditioned us by society, then it is subjective. Hence, our value opinions are subjective. That's not an argument for moral relativism. We all know our value opinions, our value beliefs are subjective. The moral absolutist wants that subjective. The subjective is the subject, right? It's what's going on inside your head. The moral absolutist wants the subjective to match the objective, wants a merger between the two, when there's a distinction between the subjective and the objective. So the third argument from social conditioning implicitly assumes the truth of moral relativism by saying that it's the values that are conditioned. If we make the distinction between value opinions and value facts, the argument no longer goes through. It does not support moral relativism at all. Okay, so that's a very important argument. I want to say just a couple of other things about it. Well, let me go through ISIS criticisms and then I'll say something else. Step 2, Isa says is false when read in one way, right? So step 2 is if something is conditioned on us by society, then it is subjective. He says, look, lots of things are conditioned on us by society, and that doesn't make them subjective. This is really just another way of saying the argument begs the question again. The idea, again, is that the rules of physics, you learn the rules of physics, the rules of math, the rules, the truths of biology and chemistry and so on and so forth. You learn those by the society in which you were raised. There are lots of other societies, by the way, that disagree with us, with our culture, with respect to physics, chemistry, biology, math, so on and so forth. But it doesn't follow, right, that all those things are subjective. The opinions we have about them are subjective, but the facts that exist independently of us are not subjective. So it looks like step 2 is false. Isa then goes on to say, look, if our values were in fact conditioned on us by society, then moral nonconformity would not be possible. The idea there is very simple. The idea is simply this. If you get all your values by society, then how do we explain persons, pretty much all of us, who think that there are some societal values that are bad, that are wrong, that are false, that should be changed? And so all of us are probably moral nonconformists with respect to some values in our society, some values in the culture in which you find yourself. And so nonconformity wouldn't make any sense. We couldn't explain it if all of the values we get are conditioned in us by society. Okay. There are arguments that Isa gives against the argument from social conditioning. I want to do one other thing here and point out what is often viewed as a devastating objection to religion. And so we could give a similar argument for a kind of religious relativism from social conditioning to the argument that Libby gave for moral relativism from social conditioning. And that argument would go something like this. Our religious beliefs, our religion is conditioned in us by society. If something's conditioned us by society, then it's subjective. Hence, religion is subjective, right? There's no fact of the matter with respect to religion. Now, once again, just as that argument from social conditioning failed for moral relativism, it's going to fail for religious relativism for the very same reasons. Just because a culture, a society, gives you a particular religious position and you're raised to have that because of in which you were born, it doesn't follow that there's no fact of the matter. Think of it like this. Had you been born in the southern United States in, say, the 1800s, it's very likely that you would have viewed black persons as not quite human, as possessible, as property. Had you been born in Nazi Germany in, say, the 20s or 30s, it's quite likely that you would have viewed Jews in a similar way. Had you been born during different eras or different cultures even today, you would think that women are less valuable than men. You might think that infanticide, right? Infanticide is the killing of infants. You might think that female infanticide is permissible had you been raised in various parts of India or other parts of the world. So does that make you worry that maybe infanticide is morally okay? Does it make you worry that maybe black persons are not quite fully human and are equivalent to property? Does it make you worry that Jews aren't quite fully human and equivalent to property? No, it probably doesn't make any of you worry about that, the fact that you would have had those beliefs had you been raised in those cultures. So similarly, why would we think then that because if I had been raised in Saudi Arabia, I would be a Muslim, then why do we think why does that get us worried about the truth of various religious claims? In other words, we don't think the fact that had we been born in some other culture that accepted slavery, we don't think, oh, well, maybe slavery is true. I shouldn't have really an opinion about that. And yet we do that same kind of reasoning with respect to religion. Again, you could think about this with respect to the flat earth. Had you been born in a certain culture at a certain time, you would have believed the earth is flat. Does that make you worry that maybe the earth really is flat? And so on and so forth. Okay, so it's a bad argument for moral relativism. It's a bad argument for religious relativism, for earth shape relativism, and so on and so forth. The next argument that Libby presents on behalf of moral relativism is the argument from freedom. So I'll call this argument for moral relativism from freedom. Step 1. If moral absolutism is true, then we cannot create our own values. Step 1. If moral absolutism is true, then we cannot create our own values. Step 2. If we cannot create our own values, then we are not free. Step 2. If we cannot create our own values, then we are not free. 3. We are free. 3. We are free. 4. Hence, we can create our own values. 4. Hence, we can create our own values. 5. Hence, moral absolutism is false. 5. Hence, moral absolutism is false. Okay. So that's the argument from freedom. Libby wants to say that we have this type of freedom to create our own values, and that somehow, that undermines moral absolutism. Okay, there's a lot going on here. I'll probably add a few critiques to this that Isa doesn't. Let's look at some of his. He argues that this argument assumes the truth of moral absolutism, and it assumes the truth of moral absolutism because it assumes that freedom is good, right? It assumes that freedom is something that we ought to strive for, that we ought to promote. Of course, if something is objectively good, then moral absolutism is true. So the argument actually assumes the truth of moral absolutism. It assumes that lack of freedom is bad, and we can say the same thing here. If something is objectively bad, then moral absolutism is true. So this argument actually assumes the truth of moral absolutism. The argument assumes moral absolutism in a different way. It assumes that everyone should have that type of freedom, right? Everyone should be able to create their own values. That's a type of freedom that should be promoted. So it assumes that there's a kind of justice, right, that we need to promote in the world. And once again, that assumes the truth of moral absolutism. Isa goes on to say that this argument will result in absurdity, right? If we really accept the idea that everyone is free to create whatever values they want, then we will have to allow the person who wants to create a system of values that oppresses women, blacks, Jews, children, disabled, the elderly, so on and so forth. Okay, so the idea here is this. If we take Libby's idea far enough, right, that we have to be free to create our own values, then we get that kind of fascism that we talked about in interview number 1. The fascism of Mussolini and Hitler, where you're free to create whatever value system, belief system, ideology you want, and you're free to impose it upon others in any way you want because there's no such thing as an objectively true value system. And so the person who creates a value system that suggests that it's okay to oppress black persons, Jewish persons, Mexican persons, women persons, disabled persons, elderly persons, whatever, that value system is not criticizable. You may not like it, but it's not false. It's not bad in some objective way. And so if they impose their value system upon you or upon our culture or our society, then that's the value system we have, and it's going to turn out that that's good. It's good to oppress women, blacks, Jews, disabled, so on and so forth. Because that value system invents the moral rules. So this idea will result in absurdity is the claim here. Isa gives another reply to this argument. It's the last one I'll consider of his, and he says, our experiences are against this. We recognize that there's a distinction between rules we can change and rules we can't. We feel it differently. We experience it differently. So there's a bunch of different versions of chess. And those versions of chess, we recognize that some of the versions are better than others. Maybe some are better for one thing, better for another. There are different, right? People are talking right now about changing some of the rules for baseball. So it's been thought maybe we should change the number of strikes, the number of balls, the time limits. People have changed the rules for basketball. The shot clock has been changed. The three-point line has been changed. And so when we change those rules, we recognize there's a difference between changing the rules of a game, maybe changing the rules of etiquette, changing the speed limit. We recognize changes like that as being very different than changing the rules of morality. So, for example, adultery is okay, is good, should be done, right? There's something different about changing that rule than changing the rules of baseball, and ISIS says we experience this within ourselves, that kind of distinction. Okay, another criticism that I want to raise of this argument is that the argument, I think, actually begs the question. So let's go back and look at the argument. Step 1, if moral absolutism is true, then we cannot create our own values. Step 2, if we cannot create our own values, then we are not free. And step 3, we are free. Now notice this claim we are free, right, actually it's an elliptical phrase. In other words, it's missing some information. So what it really needs to say is this. Let's look at step 2. It says if we cannot create our own values, then we are not free. Not free to do what? Not free to create our own values. And then step 3 says, but we are free to create our own values. So step 3, a premise in the argument, this is supposed to be a reason to accept moral relativism, is actually just a statement of moral relativism, that we are free to create our own values. So step 3 actually is moral relativism, so the only person who would accept step 3 is someone who's already committed to moral relativism. So the argument, it looks to me, begs the question at premise 3 in the argument. Okay, that's enough for the argument from freedom. Let's look at the argument from tolerance. This, once again, is one of the leading arguments that persons will put forward. If you're interested, there's been a lot of psychological, sociological research done about whether moral relativists are more tolerant than others. And it's actually not obvious. It's not the case. The claim is not has not been empirically supported. But even if it were, even if moral relativists were in fact more tolerant than moral absolutists, that would not show that moral relativism is true. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. So argument 5, for moral relativists, we'll call this the argument from tolerance. Step 1. Moral absolutism leads to intolerance, and moral relativism leads to tolerance. Step 1, moral absolutism leads to intolerance, and moral relativism leads to tolerance. Step 2, if some moral theory leads to tolerance, and a different moral theory leads to intolerance, then the first moral theory is better than the second. If some moral theory leads to intolerance and if some moral theory leads to tolerance and another moral theory leads to intolerance, then the first moral theory is better than the second. 3, therefore, moral relativism is better than moral absolutism. Okay, Isa gives a bunch of interesting replies here. Let's go through some of them. He says history is against this. Saints are tolerant of people. They're not tolerant of certain actions. So there's a distinction that Isa is going to make that is very important. The distinction between action and agent. The distinction between action and the actor. And so he says, look, saints through history have been tolerant of people, right? They've been very loving and gracious and kind and welcoming. But they're also highly intolerant of various acts, right? They suggest, they argue that different sorts of acts are destructive of persons, so don't engage in them. Those acts are bad. In the sense, in at least one sense, they're bad because the person who performs such actions will live ultimately a miserable, unflourishing life. So saints are tolerant of people. He goes on to say thugs and criminals are not. Saints are moral absolutists, and thugs and criminals are typically moral relativists. So he says, historically speaking, the argument is false. Moral absolutism actually leads to tolerance of persons. He also points out, and this I think is an important claim here, that if you value tolerance, if you think tolerance is something that should be promoted, then you're actually assuming moral absolutism, right? Because you're assuming that there's this thing, tolerance. Tolerance is objectively good, and so we should promote it. Now, You might say, well, look, I think tolerance is good, but I don't think it's objectively good. It's good to me. It's good to my culture. Well, in that case, you have no business criticizing other cultures or societies that don't value tolerance. And you have no business trying to change your culture that doesn't accept tolerance into a culture that accepts tolerance. Right? Because you think there's no objective fact of the matter. It's just like preferring chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream. If you were to try and impose your chocolate ice cream preferences on vanilla ice cream lovers, we would all rightly see you as screwed up in some way, psychologically disturbed. And so the same would be true if you think tolerance is merely a subjective value. It's merely relativistic and not objectively valuable. Isa goes on to say that there's a lot of interesting things here, that we tolerate some things in order to allow other things to be promoted, to flourish, to grow. So we tolerate smoking in order to preserve freedom. We tolerate belligerent persons in order to promote freedom, right? We tolerate persons saying things that are stupid and that we don't like in order to promote freedom, because we think that freedom is more important and conducive to flourishing than maybe restricting those other things. So tolerance here assumes moral absolutism in a bunch of different ways. And then Isa points this out, and this is a really important point here. This is the last reply of his, I think, that I'll consider. He says, look, persons who are in favor of tolerance typically think that as we become more tolerant, at least with respect to certain things, right? Keep in mind, nobody thinks we should tolerate everything, right? Should we tolerate pedophilia? Should we tolerate rape? Should we tolerate child molestation? So there are certain things that we think we ought not to tolerate. But we can tolerate those persons, right, who commit those things. We can still love them, find that their personhood is valuable, even though their actions are despicable and destructive of themselves and of others. So as we become more tolerant in certain areas, we used to not be tolerant, let's say, of dancing, and now we've become more tolerant, at least, of certain forms of dancing, and we think we've made progress. We used to not be tolerant of women having political opinions. That's progress. We used to not be tolerant of black persons having political opinions. We now are, and that's progress. And so the idea is, if you think that there's progress to be had with respect to tolerance, then you're actually assuming moral absolutism. And here's how. The idea of progress assumes that there is some goal or standard that we are getting closer to, right? You can't progress in an area unless there's some sort of end, goal, standard that you're moving towards. Otherwise, if there's no goal, there's no standard, there's no end, there's no sort of ruler by which to measure your movements, your beliefs, your actions against, then there's no such thing as progress. There's no way to measure progress. Progress doesn't make sense in that domain. So progress assumes moral absolutism. It assumes that there's a standard. There are these rules and truths that we're trying to get closer to. We're trying to move towards. And so that presupposes moral absolutism and presupposes the falsity of moral relativism. So it turns out then, interestingly enough, that tolerance, the argument from tolerance, actually is an argument that only the moral absolutist can make. The moral relativist cannot make the argument from tolerance. So that's an important point. I hope you understand it. That's it for today. I'll see you tomorrow.